My name's Derek. With me is my partner in crime, CJ, and we're going to talk a little bit about vendor security questionnaires. The reason we decided to do this together is you kind of get the best of both worlds. I have a lot of experience in the banking side where soliciting these questionnaires and trying to get a lot of stuff back for vendor management. CJ has done this, of course, as well. But as a virtual CISO, he has been on the receiving end of many of these questionnaires. So between the two of us, you kind of get the best of both worlds when we're having this type of discussion.
So much fun to be on the receiving end on these.
So one of the things we want to talk about is a little bit is obviously why we do this. So back in my misspent youth, you could work for a company and have almost everything done in house. And there were, you may partner with a vendor, but it may have been like a paper supplier, or you bought a printer or something like that. Very, it was a one-to-one, a very easy kind of relationship that's out there. So today, really, you're not doing your business without third parties anymore. In many cases, these vendors either have your data, store your data, process your data. And or run applications for you. So they're considered critical vendors because if they go down, if there's an issue, or God forbid they get breached, your organization could suffer in a huge way. So as time has gone on and security has taken a forefront, how we vet these vendors and these people, these third parties that we do business with, is going to be crucial, not only to our business resiliency, but our reputation and the ability to do business, it just in general terms.
Yeah, and just to add a little bit of color with that, Derek, too, is when you think about these critical vendors, right, and the reason that we are assessing them to the point that we are, right, it's a definition of what's critical, right, and I'll give you what I call a CJ definition, right. That critical vendor is somebody who is critical to your service delivery, right? They go belly up, you go belly up. You can't deliver your services without them. In some worlds, we call them subservice organizations, right? But for this conversation, they're critical. They also have access to systems and to either employee data, company data, or customer data, right? And then again, that's the part of what are we protecting here, right? And protecting the organization is extending that organization is going to be these vendors who are critical to you.
Yep, excellent point. So how do we do that? Well, we ask questions. We ask lots of questions, and hopefully we get lots of answers. A good third party, a good vendor who you're partnering with or doing business with, should have a good security posture and be able to answer these in fairly short order. You, of course, also being a good business owner, or having a good business, will be able to do the same. So all a good security questionnaire is a solicitation, my goodness, of knowledge. It's trying to allow us to understand the people we're partnering with and the security controls that they have in place. So why do they matter? Why does it matter? Obviously it gives, getting these questions gives us a good sense, not only of the security of the organization, but in a lot of cases, the organization in general coming through. So it allows you to identify possible risks of doing business with the vendors. And in many cases, depending on who you are and what you do, it can be a legal or regulatory requirement coming from the banks and credit unions. If you don't have a robust vendor management system in place, if you're not soliciting this information, if you're not doing vendor reviews, the regulators will come in and spank you. And they've gotten more and more stringent as time goes on. I've watched in the past several years them ask regulated industries, are you asking questions about cloud? Are you asking questions about foreign vendors? The next one that'll come up, are you asking questions if the vendor is using AI in anything? So all these, and the easiest way to do this for us is to ask the questions through a security questionnaire. Now, I'm sure I'm sure CJ would just rather have a sit at the bar over a beer and answer these questions because it's a lot easier than filling them out.
Obviously that's always going to be the answer that yes, it is. But again, it's important, right? And I think I'm probably in the minority here. I like vendor questionnaires. I like receiving them. I think it's another way to assess my program. And for us, we're representing multiple companies. So when you're representing, a particular company in a particular vertical, a particular industry, right? Staying fresh on what's being asked and how do we answer those, right? We're going to answer them truthfully, right? Is this truly a yes or is this a no? If we're not doing this, right, are we okay with this being a no, right? And if it's a no, do we have to invest in it, right? So I take that response and I add it quickly to my risk register, and I make sure that we're moving the program forward while we're using, through the questionnaire process. Now, is it horrible when it's 850 questions and it's a full SIG? Yes, and you get kind of buried in it. But you get a really good questionnaire that's really assessing your program and where you're at, right? You can use that for your own benefit, which again, I love that part of the process.
Sadist. All right. Um, here are some of the struggles that everybody faces, and CJ kind of addressed them. In at least the first one is that we've received and sent questionnaires that are 50 questions. We've sent 100 questions. CJ and I have both seen vendors send 500 questionnaires. And so depending on who you're doing business with, especially if they're going to sign on with you, the questions may seem incredibly overwhelming and time consuming. So on both ends. And if you're sending out one of those questions, in a lot of cases, it becomes a bottleneck, especially if you have to wait on them to fill it out. You'll get hit from up above that says, how come this isn't in place yet? How come we haven't signed the contract? Haven't we go through this? And so there's a lot of stuff back and forth. And on the receiving side, when you're faced with a security questionnaire and you don't have a mature security program, people get frightened. They say, well, I don't want to answer no to this, but we're not really doing it. And I don't even, I'm not aware of this question and things like that. So one of the things CJ and I have learned through the years is, in a lot of cases, out of those 500 questionnaires, they become boilerplate to us in a lot of cases. So taking a look at the questions, there might be 100 out of those 500 that you can mark not applicable. And I've had clients say, well, we don't want to do that. And I said, but it really doesn't apply to you. And so, being honest and going through is the only way you're going to be able to answer those questionnaires, one, timely, and two, accurately.
Yeah, and I'd love to hear some feedback in the chat when I ask this question. One of the things that we're seeing is you have different points in time where you start seeing more and more questionnaires, right? I think after the CrowdStrike issue, I know for me personally, I would tell you that the amount of questionnaires that have come in are double or triple what I was seeing before that happened. And what's happening is it's becoming so time consuming that we're using all of our resources to just answer these questionnaires, and we're losing the time and the ability to actually push the program forward and take on other initiatives that really enhance our security program and enable our business. And I'd love to hear if anybody else is having that same problem. And again, not just making a problem statement without a solution, because the solution is easy, right? Spend more money, get more resources, outsource, whatever you're doing, right? That's not always a viable solution. So I'd be curious to hear if you guys are seeing that same problem. As we, again, the importance of getting through these questionnaires is, back to the business part, right? We're not getting the business in if we can't get the questionnaires completed. So,
and one of the things as well that we're going to talk about a little bit after we talk about the questionnaires themselves is there are alternatives to answering these questionnaires over and over and over again, even though they're all different and things like that. So basically, the last slide talks a little bit, and CJ and I will go on ad nauseum about you heard him mention SIG SIG questionnaires. While those can be used proactively for you, as well as receive them and have to fill them out, and SOC 2 reports, and there are companies that create security packages rather than answering a questionnaire, and we'll get one of the more recent ones I took a look at, I think it was Rapid7, and they have a whole basically book of everything they do, and it's shiny and it's it's very well put together. But it's a true narrative of what they do rather than doing yes no questions or anything else like that. And some of the ways to do that, some of the advantages to that is the ability to say, okay, here's our posture. If we're not going to answer 500 questions. If you have something that isn't answered by this, come back to us and we'll have the discussion. But we'll talk a little bit about that a little bit later on as well, because I know CJ has a ton of thoughts, and so I snuck in the last slide and didn't tell him, so he can look
Huh.
at that one.
No, this ought to be fun surprise. I'm surprised.
All right. So, and obviously this is kind of a boilerplate. Just because somebody gives you a 500 questionnaire, you're not going to cut off business or stop doing business with them. Where the whole point to this is to forge these relationships and go through. And in a lot of cases, once the relationship is formed, you understand them better, they understand you better, and you do. There are benefits of having all this in place. And so, and this really is a risk management exercise. Rather, it's not something, we're not trying to avoid doing stuff, and we're certainly CJ and I are huge believers in transparency. I want to, if I'm working with your organization, I need to know how your organization does stuff security wise, and how it's going to benefit me, and if there's anything that you're not doing, where that's going. A real simple example is, I have a lot of companies that have partners, third parties that we sign on with and do things. We have password requirements. They could be PCI requirements. They could be banking requirements. They could be whatever. And let's say 12-character password has to be reset twice a year, X, Y, and Z. And we could have vendors that don't adhere to this. So it's one of those that, if a vendor doesn't adhere to your standards, what do? Do you make an exception? Do you have the vendor change? So it's getting these answers in advance before something happens, is going to make life easier in the long run, even though it's a heavier lift prior to the relationship itself.
Yeah, and I got a story. So I think stories are always fun. So I've got a company I've been working with for about 5 years now, and in my first year with working with that company, they had what we considered a critical vendor. They're going through the SOC 2 process, so is a subservice organization, and they've been working with them for about 20 years, right? So it's been a long-standing relationship. So now in the first year, they're just finally getting a security program. So in stepping that security program up, we went and reviewed all of their critical vendors, and went and did a review of this vendor, and crickets back. So finally we follow up, and I have, she's the president, CEO of the company. So I say, can you mind just bridging this communication gap, and finally gets a conversation started. So I said, listen, here's our questionnaire. I know you guys don't have a SOC 2 at the moment. That's fine. We can take some other information and kind of start piecing it together, see what you have. So I asked for their security policies. Is one of the things that I asked for, and they gave me back, and hopefully this resonates with the 66 of you that are here. Is they gave me back now remember, I come from a military background, so the 853 was my Bible for a very long time. They gave me the entire NIST 853, and it's 1,600 pages, and it's 800 something controls. And I called them and said, this cannot be your policy. This is a policy this we adhere to. They said, how many people do you have in your company? I said, about 75. I said, this is a military grade policy. There's no way you comply to all this. Like, it wasn't real. So where's my issue, right? Not that they can't comply with, maybe not that it is that they can't comply with all those things. They don't have a security program, right? So I raise it up as a risk, and talked to her name's Catherine, right? Talked to her about it and said, listen, it's you've been working with them for 20 years, right? I'm not going to sit here and tell you can't work with them, right? I'm going to tell you they're higher risk, and we got to keep a little bit more better eye on them and keep pushing the envelope. Now, fast forward 5 years, right? Their security program is a lot more refined, and we still consider them critical, right? But not at that high risk level, because they've got a much more mature program, right? So it started 5 years ago, and not only have we enhanced the program of the company and working with them, but now their vendors are starting to enhance it as well. So it's a nice little trickle down effect. So again, interesting story is you try to say, hey, in modern business, can we say, no, you can't work with them? no, we've been working with them for 20 years. We're going to grandfather them in, but here's what we're going to do going forward. So
I have a couple of questions and comments that I kind of wanted to interject with here. The first one, which I think was kind of asked more towards everyone collectively as a whole, was, has anyone witnessed any companies or vendors that push back and do not complete the questionnaires and just point customers to their SOC reports? And before you guys kind of touch upon that one, I actually just went through this myself with a cloud-based platform that we at Compass were evaluating, and the platform had a very low cost, high sales volume model. Imagine something like a Netflix where you only pay $20 a month and they have millions of customers, as opposed to a small handful of a couple hundred customers, maybe, and each one paying $5,000 a month. A company like that might be a lot more willing to fill out a security questionnaire than your Netflixes of the world or whoever it may be that are dealing in such large volumes and might not have the capacity, or might not allot the capacity to answer specific vendor questionnaires. And that was kind of what we had experienced, because this particular platform only had a fee of $25 a month. They weren't really committing a lot of manpower to answering our security questionnaire or anybody else's. They would just direct us to their SOC 2 report and their security center on their website. Have you guys seen that as well?
yeah, I'll give you a pretty direct answer here. And again, CJ's commentary, so don't take it and hold it against anybody else. If you're a company that's paying, so the way I approach it, and our team approaches it, is if you have a SOC 2, we will take your SOC 2. We have a process where we go through that SOC 2, and we have a set of controls that we need to see that you line up for, right? So if our company has, this is our what we map to, these are the controls that matter to us. We've set the stage, and we will go through your SOC 2 and take out what you're doing for that and see if you satisfy it. Anything that doesn't satisfy it, that's what we push back and ask a couple questions specifically to that. I think to me, that's the respectful way to handle it. If you're spending the time, the effort, and the money to go through the SOC 2 process, which is basically a third-party attestation that says we're doing these things, the controls are designed, they're implemented, and now they're operating, right? To me, that says that you're doing what you're doing, right? I have to trust the audit firm that is accredited, right, and is attested to this. So if you have a SOC 2 and I'm running your security program, we will take that. I still may ask to see that, hey, can I see your pen test results? Can I see some other things? But I will absolutely take a SOC 2 in lieu of sending them, the SIG Lite or the SIG or our custom questionnaire.
And I think I had another question here. Do you believe the CrowdStrike event was an isolated event?
No. So it's funny, Derek. When Derek and I did this in California last week, one of the conversations we had before we went into it, and I'm not sure, Derek, if you're unmuted or not yet, but if not, Nick, Derek.
I am. Yes, I just noted that. I'm sorry.
But before the CrowdStrike event happened, I never thought about CrowdStrike being something I considered a critical vendor. I never thought about CrowdStrike having access, or any of my agents having access to the kernel like that. It just wasn't something that crossed my mind. Once the CrowdStrike event happened, and it looks like it's a failure on the process side, and where, if every company has an SDLC and has proper patch schedule, release schedule, we're doing testing first, and we're evolving to production and critical items potentially last, then it doesn't happen. But is every company following their SDLC perfectly? I think what the answer is no, right? We hope they are. We have the documentation in place, but are they? So the answer is no. And then, so to answer your question, I think it happens again. I think it happens more than we realize. Does it affect every system almost in the world because it's attached with Microsoft into the kernel, right? Hopefully not. But that's something it just adds more to our plate now to figure out, hey, what of our agents have this kind of access? And if it goes down, it takes our entire system down. I never would have thought CrowdStrike going down would have taken companies, organizations, right down the way it did. But I don't think it's isolated for the patching the process reason.
So now that I've found my voice again, to piggyback a little bit on what CJ was saying, and actually it rolls right into the next slide, that you're going to have vendors that don't want to do this or think they can't or anything. And really, this also goes into what's your level of risk with this vendor? How good do you feel based on what they do? Now, again, if it's AWS, they're not, they're just going to point you to a link on the website and say, go here. All our stuff is here over and over and over again. They're not going to, they're not going to get warm and fuzzy with you to be able to do that. But there, a lot of vendors, I had one years ago, and it was either Verizon or AT&T, and it was their questionnaire. And, a lot of cases you can get on the phone and these people usually are willing to help. And your clients, if they're receptive, even getting on the phone, you can get a sense of what they do and how they do it and everything. And you can make, it's your business. You get to say, okay, well, we're going to make an exception that they didn't answer the questionnaire, but I, got them on the phone. We talked through all this. They showed us a couple of things. I think we're good to go, and we can go through this. Now, the flip side of that is if you get a vendor that says, hey, deal with us or not, we don't care. If it's somebody that, you can find the services somewhere else, that can be a red flag and say, hey, if we're not forthcoming on, our general security practices and how we do things, I would start looking at another vendor and see if there is somebody that lines up more properly. Because it's not a question of suspicion, but again, these, especially again, if it's a gardener, if it's somebody painting your house, you probably don't care about the security questionnaire. But if you're storing customer data with this client, with this vendor, or running stuff through their systems, you want to know. You want that because if somebody comes and they get breached, your customers aren't coming after them; they're coming after you. So there is a level of trust and security and comfort in this, and so if they come to the table and say, no, we don't have this in place, but let us talk to you about it, that goes a long way for me versus nope, we're not going to, we don't have the time to do this. This is our boilerplate. You have to do that. And like CJ said, consider alternatives. If they have a third party audit that shows me if they've gone through a NIST cybersecurity audit, if they've gone through 171 or a CIS or an ISO audit or something else like that, I can take that in, at least because that shows me they have security controls that have been rated by a third party independently of them. So they're not even answering the questions. We're getting somebody else who's attesting to them. So there are absolutely ways around if a vendor doesn't want to answer a security questionnaire, but you've got to have something that mitigates the risk of using the vendor.
Yeah. Well, and I think that goes back to, I see the question from Jesse in the chat, right? And talking about a questionnaire being independently audited and how do we hold them accountable, right? And I think it's sometimes the contract will generally hold you accountable. I think the questionnaire is us doing our due diligence, right? To make sure that we get that comfortability with the program that you have, that you're not going to be, that the risk is low, right? Or that and sometimes it's maybe a little bit of self-preservation that we've done our due diligence, right? And it allows us to make the best decision. I don't think I don't see situations where we're independently auditing a questionnaire, but I think the questionnaire itself is going to be different than a SOC report or a
Yep.
PCI or an ISO certification, a little bit different. It's more due diligence than, audit or regulatory events.
And one of the questions we ask when I set up a questionnaire all the time is, have you been through an independent audit? So we're not auditing the questionnaire, but I ask the question of the vendor. Have they gone through an independent audit? Because that goes a long way to comfort level, because that means they care enough about the security to have somebody else come in and look at it for them. And we'll get into kind of what parts of what kind of questions or what topics you should be looking at as part of those in the next couple of slides as we come up.
And I had a few more questions come in while you guys were just talking. And thank you to everybody for all the activity in the chat. We really love to see that. So let me just kind of go through those most recent questions here. How do you approach presenting a vendor questionnaire to a vendor where there is an established relationship as opposed to a new vendor?
So there's a couple of things. One, normally, if I know the vendor, if I can send them an email and say, listen, we're doing our own security review of our own systems, and part of that is making sure that we align with our third parties properly, and we're in sync with everything. A lot of times, they do it at contract renewal if you have a formal contract. If not, then again, what I normally suggest is you take it on yourself. We're going through our own security review to be able to do this as part of the, and as part of our security review, we're making sure that our critical vendors are, we reach out to the critical vendors and we're aligned with them and making sure that that both sides are on the same page.
Yeah, and Catherine, I apologize first. I say I'm sorry to do this to you. However, right, this is our contractual regulatory requirement, right? And this is what we need to do in this day and age to protect our organization and as a critical vendor of ours, right? Something that we have to go through and try to make it easy on them as possible, right? You heard me say before, if you have a SOC 2, if you have a risk assessment, I'm happy to go through that and do the work, on that side, right? Pay respect to the time and effort and money you've already spent to do this. I have no problem. But again, I start with I'm sorry.
And I do see there was another question here, and you did answer that. I'll just read it to everybody so everybody can see it. Do you think exceptions or explanations received outside of a policy or audit should be documented and dated? For example, you get them on the phone to explain a few unknowns. CJ, you said absolutely. Do you want to expand upon that point at all?
Yeah, I would definitely will follow up. Exceptions. Listen, and I learned this from a boss a long time ago while I was in the Coast Guard, right? Is I don't want perfect people, right? I think a mistake was made. Somebody said that, apologize for it. I said, listen, mistakes happen, right? No perfect people. There's no perfect security program, right? And if you get an assessment that's always, if you ask 150 questions, you don't have a single no or finding, right? There's probably a couple lies in there. And the example I'll go with is when it comes to vulnerability management, right? I expect you to have a pen test, right? If you get a good full pen test, I hope you have a finding. I hope that they dug deep enough to find some kind of exploitable vulnerability that exists in your system, right? I have zero problem with that. As a guy that's been doing security for almost 25 years and truly embraces the importance of it, I want you to have findings. I want findings myself because we got to patch those and get better and move forward. And if you show me that you have a vulnerability, I'm not holding that against you. I want to see that what your plan is to now patch that and fix that and move forward, and that you're taking that risk, you're taking that finding and doing the right thing with it. So I think, Lord, I hope that answers your question, that I don't mind exceptions and I don't mind conversation. And I think you need to have that to really understand the full context of it. But embrace the findings, right? And tell me what you're going to do with that finding.
And remember the goal. So the goals of the security questionnaires are on both sides. When you get them, they want to make sure that they're mitigating their risk by going with you, and just like you are with them, and that minimum security standards are met so that there's a level of comfort and understanding between them. These are positive things, because once you start working with these people, especially if you like them, it's very, very, you guys know how hard it is to switch vendors and go around and set new things up and stuff like that. So you want to pick a vendor that you're going to be comfortable with and hopefully is going to be a long-term vendor. So doing this due diligence is going to allow you to keep that relationship going. And it's very, very important. So these are, yes, they can be painful, but there really is, there's good logic behind doing it. And so a couple of things we take a look at. How do we make this a little bit less painful and a little bit easier for anyone? One is standards and templates. If you guys are creating, questions for every vendor that you want, you're already way behind the 8 ball when that's going. But now, having said that, there are critical vendors that we ask things for. There are mid-tier vendors that we ask things for. There are low-tier vendors that maybe I say, hey, can you sign your name on a dotted line somewhere? It really should. These questionnaires should be risk-based. The ones you're sending out, the ones you're getting, you don't have a lot of control over. But and that's one of the things I find too, is sometimes when they go 100% boilerplate, one of the issues there is you could get a 500 question questionnaire and the service you're providing has very, very little to do with it. So that's reaching out to the vendor and things like that. But there are a lot of programs that use vendor management software that have, anything from spreadsheets. The SIG program that CJ mentioned is a spreadsheet of good, vendor questionnaire controls. to be able to have that. But having a process and a standardization in place so that you're asking the heavy vendors the heavy questions, the light vendors the light questions, and in between, and take a look at it once a year. That I've seen questionnaires that that talk about things like modems, which pretty much show me that they haven't been updated in some time. And so there's, having that up to date, you may be able to drop 25 questions off a questionnaire if you take a look at it and it's 2 years old because they're not relevant to what you're doing anymore.
Yeah. Well, and again, and one of these, Derek, and the tool I use, and actually it was nice to hear a couple of people out in California using the tool as well, is we use a tool called Black Kite.
Yep.
And Black Kite has a feature where you can create a standard, you can use a standard questionnaire, right? A SIG, a SIG-Lite, a KEG, one of the other ones, but you can also create a custom questionnaire and you can build it into the system to where you have your expected output. And then you can upload that completed questionnaire, and it'll give you feedback as to what they answered appropriately and what they didn't answer appropriately, so that you can go back and now you've kind of minimized the review at the end to actually say, okay, here's their findings, here's a list of things that they're not doing, and it really speeds that process up so that you're doing it properly, right? This is due diligence. Really, I hate the term, but we're doing it with the best effort to make a decision on whether this vendor really presents a risk to us. And don't forget, every vendor is a risk.
Presents a risk, right?
And it's how do you control that risk to the best of your ability, right?
And is that risk acceptable to you?
Yeah.
It's okay to have a risk event. And again, I'll go back to banking just because that's what I cut my teeth on. Any mortgage processor is a high risk vendor. There's no way around it. But I want to see that you have controls in place, that you've mitigated as much as you possibly can. I'm never going to rate it a low risk vendor. But it's a critical vendor that I have to use. So it's okay to have a vendor that is a risky vendor, but you have to take it in context.
There's a question here. I think it's topical because where we're at from Catherine about how do you determine which vendors are heavy versus light in a B2B context? Then it just changed on me, so I just lost it.
I can go back.
No, I got it. I got it now. But no, I was saying on the chat.
Oh, the question. Sorry,
something moved. But I think again goes back to kind of where we started. What are those critical vendors, right? For me, the criticalist of critical vendors are those ones that I don't think that's a term, but have your business has dependence. It's dependent on it. If they are not available, you cannot provide your services, right? Your customers cannot access your site, your services. Everything kind of stops. That's in a business. I go back to my military days, right? That didn't matter to me, right? What mattered to me was protecting top secret information and Department of Defense information and data, right? In this business world, those operations are paramount, and then it ties back to the company, the customer, and the employee data that we're trying to protect, right? The more access they have to your systems or to that data or dependency, the heavier the questionnaires and the due diligence has to be to be able to get them through the door. Hope that answered your question.
I have another question in here as well. What is the standard practice if confidential or internal information is requested? For example, if there are policies that are considered internal only, is it standard to refuse to provide those policies or information?
Kevin, I'll tell you what I do is I have my policy set, and the way I write policies is I put them all into one ISMS, or call it WISP, call it whatever you want to call it. So it's clickable and it's easy to navigate. But B, it has the cover page, it has the table of contents, it has the updates and history page, it has the approval page, and it has the introduction. It's about a 2-page, explains the mappings and what our purpose and scope of the policy is. And I share those 8 pages. And if they want more to actually read our policies, then I'll do a screen share, or I'll say which ones do you want, and I'll redact whatever we think that is sensitive. But I only share the first 8 pages, and I generally do not get pushback where they ask for more. Because they don't want to read our policies as much as our employees don't want to read our policies. So that's usually worked.
Beauty. All right. Best practices. These are, I hate to say it, these are kind of gimmies. Make sure you communicate expectations. Make sure you when you get the stuff back, don't just give it a rubber stamp. Oh, they gave me a SOC report. oh, they gave me their, their BCP plan. Take a look at it, at least the table of contents, and see, if it's got key stuff in that you're looking for, and everything else like that. So that's when you're taking a look at that, and leverage, like CJ mentioned, Black Kite. There are tools that will help you rate a vendor, both online and if you feed them information. So you don't have to do it all, man. It can be very subjective based on what you're doing, and who it is, and what their risk is to you. But there are absolutely tools out there that will help with it as well. When you're filling them out, answer the questions that they ask. Okay. Brief explanation. This shouldn't be a paragraph for every question. If it is, you're usually doing an explanation why something isn't in place. Don't be, and I mentioned this before, don't be afraid to mention, to call it NA. It may not apply to you. If the vendor has an issue, they'll probably come back and say, well, that's not acceptable, or what do you mean it's not applicable? And you can explain it. But there's, an excellent thing is, if they're using a boilerplate, they might have 5 or 10 cloud questions. You might not be using cloud. It's all NA. You might not be processing data for them, so any data becomes not applicable. It's it's okay to answer those that way. And the other thing is, the reason you don't go into a ton of detail is you don't want to provide confidential information or even security information, because I can tell you right now, these questionnaires, the answers to them are not stored under Fort Knox in a lot of cases. In a lot of cases, there's a risk manager or a vendor manager that has it in an unlocked desk drawer somewhere. So, you give them the answers to the questions, but in a lot of cases, if it's more than a yes or a no, we don't want IP addresses, or even, quite honestly, I usually don't even list the solutions we use. It's, yes, we have DLP. Yes, we have anti-malware in place, but I don't put the versions or what they are. The vendor 99.9% of the time is not going to come back and say, what do you use?
So here's where I love when I finally disagree with you. It's been 40 minutes, the longest we've ever gone without me disagreeing with you. Is I actually do. Again, it takes a little bit more time, but when I put the tool that I'm using, right, Darktrace, or a highly reputable tool, it puts credibility to our company, to our program. So I will put the name of it in there a lot of times, especially if it gives me credibility. Now, if it's not going to give me credibility, right, then maybe I won't answer it to that extent. But if it does give me credibility, I certainly will. The other side I will tell you is, and this is, repeat, I did mention this earlier, but I really think it's important. Answer these truthfully. Again, I'm a truthful person. Maybe that's why I sit here and say this, but do not lie, right? A no does not mean you're not going to be able to work with these people. They're doing their due diligence the same way you're doing your due diligence. And I truly mean it. We're all, again, I don't see titles of everybody's names in here, right? But whether you're a security professional or you're a COO, right? Our goal is to protect the organization the best we can. If you use these and answer them properly, and take the no and say, all right, we got to add this to our risk register, or this is now a budgetary item for next year. How do we grow our program? And you can use this as leverage from a budgetary standpoint. Hey, we need this. Now, is it, you're going to get to, I'll go story time again. There's things that are showstoppers, right? I have a company that we do a lot of things. They have not gone the SOC 2 route yet. And the business's response has been, once it starts costing us business, then we'll go down that road. Well, it cost us business, right? We had 2 companies, and it was like a $450,000 in annual revenue that they were not going to sign without going through a SOC 2. Well, that was enough to trigger the SOC 2, and now we've started that process. So we baked it into the contract that we will have SOC 2 by a certain point. But you got to still answer it properly. You can't say you have a SOC 2 when you don't, and you can't say you're doing things when you don't, because it goes back to the question that I think it was a Jesse that was asking, previously, about at what point are you going to be held liable for your answers in a questionnaire, right? If you're bold-faced lying and clearly you didn't have this, right? I think you're at some point you're going to be held responsible, and I think that keep us honest, and just use it as a tool to grow your program. Honestly, I think it's such a great opportunity.
So we've got about 20 minutes left. So we're gonna, luckily, out of the 7 slides that are left, there are 4 that are really kind of read the slide stuff. So we do have extra time to talk and things like that. But so, we've talked about how to fill them out. And I can't agree more with CJ when he says, be honest. And there's no need to fudge it. In most cases, they're going to keep doing, the fact that you're in that relationship, to be a deal breaker, you've got to figure out why it's a deal breaker. And the SOC 2 was a perfect example. But if you don't have one control out of 50, you may have something that takes the place of it three lines down. So just be honest. But
here's another example. I know we're going to lose time, so I won't.
That's okay.
But a SIM tool is another one that if you don't have one, feels like it's a showstopper, right? But if you can say we don't have a SIM, however, right, here are all of our logs, right, here's how long they're capped, right, we can expound on it until not having a SIM becomes a showstopper for somebody, right? Again, just another example that I've had to live through.
I have one more question. I'm going to try to squeeze in here super quick. Can you discuss the risks of placing too much comfort in the online vendor monitoring / risk scoring services? How do you explain to management that a risk score alone is not a vendor risk management program?
So
go, Derek. I'll let you go because I
okay.
hours
Yep.
on it.
So looking at that, and again, it's an arrow in the quiver. It absolutely it gives credence. It lends, but every relationship is different. The real question you want to ask is, what's the risk to the organization of using this vendor? The score that comes out from the third party oftentimes is in a vacuum. They look at, they look at a SOC 2 report, they look at stuff that's out there, they do a website scan, all useful, all valuable, but does it mitigate the risk of the function you're doing with that third party? And so from that case, you want to take it's all, like I said, arrow in the quiver. It's part of the pie, but it's not the whole pie. At the end of the day, you want to be able to go back and say, okay, our requirements say that our vendors have to use MFA for logging in. If they don't use MFA, and they only use username and password, what data are they storing? Is it comfort? Is it not comfort? In some cases, a vendor like Black Kite or one of the third-party risk scores and everything may not get to that level of importance and comfort because they're doing a general review. So that's where I would go with that. This is the vendor scores and things like that. It's almost icing on the cake because you've done your due diligence and you've gotten like a third party to say, yep, they're in good shape from what we can see. So it's a combination of stuff.
Yeah, I'll go one more different angle too, just to have a little differing look. And Doug, curious to know if this is the route that you're looking. Is BitSite, Security Scorecard, Black Kite? They offer to people who subscribe, they offer a score based on a public attack surface and what their scans say and what they come across. That score becomes somewhat public, and other customers, potential customers, can look at that score and say, whoa, we can't go with them. They're BitSite, they're Black Kite, their security scorecard is too low. We can't go with them, right? I think when that's the case, that's a risk in and of itself because you're going to lose business because of that score. Is that score accurate, right? And we've had situations where I use security scorecards as an example with a large company. They were picking up on honeypots that we had, and they were finding that didn't have the proper protections in SSL and TLS to be able to protect the data when it was like that for a reason, right? Because it was a honeypot. So we had to give that explanation, and it kept recorrecting, and it kept lowering our score by like 10 points. So that's a risk in of itself that you can potentially lose business because that score becomes somewhat public. So in some ways, you have to react to what that score is, positive or negative.
So, yeah, and that's a great point. So we've talked about all of this, in these bullets. So I don't think we need to belabor this slide any longer. The next one basically is hey, if you can align with a security framework, it's going to make your questionnaire flow a little bit more, a little bit easier. It's regular assessments, due diligence. All the security frameworks ask for certain things across the board. And so you're going to see a lot of commonalities beside them, especially if you've tied yourself to NIST or CMMC or CIS or anything else like that. Then you ask similar questions to your vendors because you want them to align with what you need to align with. And that's all. It's as simple as that. So what goes into these questionnaires? A decent questionnaire, obviously, and CJ and I have spoken to a lot of this. He's got that, the first couple of pages. You want to look for, who's the vendor? What do they do? What's the description of their business? Then you kind of get into things like the security policies and the governance. Those are all very standard. Do they have a program in place? They should. Is it, does it roll up? Does it start from the top down? Then you launch into things like data protection and encryption, and what data are you storing with them? This may be a super important question. You may not be storing with them at all, so it may be an NA or not important. So this is where you kind of get to customize it based on what's there. But having, asking these types of questions, and each one you can get in, probably 4 or 5 general points of that sort of thing from those areas. And these are all key areas that you want to be able to understand what the vendor is. How is their network? What are they using? Are they all cloud-based? Do they have a data center somewhere? Is it all in-house? Stuff like that goes to business resiliency. And again, if it's all cloud, physical security may be immaterial. If it's all in-house, physical security might be critical. It depends on the vendor. And so some of these questions, it really is, depending on who you use and what you do. Don't expect identical answers across every questionnaire, because you're not going to have it. Are you an entity that has to comply with CMMC or NIST 800-171 or PCI or anything else like that? PCI, in 4.0 requires, if you're signing up with a PCI vendor, that vendor has to be PCI compliant. Your due diligence should be asking them for their attestation of compliance, just as a very common example. Risk management, do they have a risk management program? Are they doing, are they getting third-party attestations? We talked about that before. Is someone coming in, looking at their controls, doing for them, and making sure that their posture is up to date and being reviewed on a regular basis? You can always do it internally, but CJ and I are he mentioned it earlier. You want those pen tests. You want them to be able to find something that, because nobody's perfect, and close the gaps, make the recommendations, because then you have a living, breathing program that you're always looking to improve, always looking to get better, always looking at new controls.
It's objective for a reason, right? We all get tunnel vision. It's completely natural. We all have the areas that we're best or more comfortable in, and that we can make the most progress in. So you're always going to have parts of the program that are stronger than others. Having a risk management program that looks at, I'm going to call it enterprise risk, right? It's the entire organization, and it has to roll up. Does that program do that? If it doesn't, right, then you're missing something, right? That risk is staying at the lowest level, and we're never going to be able to get traction, budget, or anything else to be able to enhance and remediate and lower that risk. So having risks, absolutely normal. Like we said before, not addressing them, not having a treatment plan for them, not acceptable.
Right. Is the vendor a software as a service vendor? If it is, the application questions and the application security, software security, those are going to be critical questions. How do they handle user access? How are they doing reviews? How are they doing coding? Those are all critical questions depending on what the vendor is. Data breach handling and history, you want that. I don't care who the vendor is at that point. Is this one, we've seen over the past 12 months, multiple third parties get compromised where our clients have nothing to do with it at all. And so how do you handle that? There's stuff written in the contract that says, hey, we will notify and we will do this and we will do that. But you want, do they have a good IR plan? How do they report? Who do they roll up to? What's their requirements in going in? And so that bullet right there, the third bullet on this, is going to be is probably one of the most important ones that I have going forward, just because of all the data sharing and responsibility and network sharing that is going on that you're never going to get out of anymore. And then ensure, does your vendor have cybersecurity insurance? And if they're breached, is it enough to cover their stuff? If they're breached and your data is compromised, is it covered by their insurance? Does it have to be covered by yours? I've got several institutions that are asking those questions right now, because when I asked them the questions, nobody could tell me. So those are important. SLA, if you're in, if this is a MSP that you're using, what's their SLA? Is, how quickly do they have to get back to you on certain items? If something goes down, if there's a ticket that's opened, everything else like that. What's the performance monitoring? How does that sort of work? And this all rolls up into vendor compliance and continuous management and things like that. If you're a government, if you're a regulated entity, and we mentioned before, if you have to adhere to PCI, if you have to do DFARS, NIST 800, 171, CMMC, any of those things, do your vendors need to adhere to them for you to be compliant? If they do they have those certifications? Do they have those attestations that are important where that kind of comes in?
Yeah. And just to add on, Derek, when I read your top two, right,
Yep.
those to me come in the contract review, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that we're looking at that from a legal standpoint, making sure that it's tied there. Again, I have no problem asking for the insurance and liability.
Yep.
I don't know that it's up to me or any of us here that are security professionals to say, hey, that's enough insurance to cover our business, the losses, right? And that's the tie back to the business, right? A lot of these things in a vacuum are being done for IT and security, right? But are they, right? Can they tie back to the contract and to the rest of the business? And how do you tie that together, right?
No, totally agree. There are some. So what I found, the reason why these can be important is I've also come across some that either don't have formal contracts, or the contracts aren't, they're so boilerplate that some of this stuff isn't mentioned. So again, it all depends on the vendor and how things are set up, and your company as well. CJ, best practice absolutely is there should be, a contract that deals with this, and it should be spelled out and it should be easy. If it's not, then you absolutely want to ask the questions. That's all. And so now go ahead.
So I have two questions. I know you're kind of getting towards the end of your slides.
Yeah,
do you want to
please.
take them
This
now,
is
or do you want
actually
to
the
take them at
last
the end?
slide. So
I'll wait till.
My surprise, Derek.
This is the surprise slide. So
Okay.
so again, we've spent the whole time talking about, the security questionnaires. We've mentioned all this stuff in the past. So there, the one of the things that I wanted to address is there are many companies that don't want to answer the questionnaires. A SOC 2 report, and CJ and I have talked about, one of the great things is a SOC 2 type 2, because that deals with the, allows you to show these are our security things, these are our security posture in place, these are the controls we use, and on top of that, it's been assessed by a third party, usually in the last 12 months. So a lot of clients will say, here's our SOC 2 report. If you have anything outside of that, ask us, but this is what we're not answering your 500 question questionnaire. This is our SOC 2, and give us the delta, because we're not spending that time.
Not to beat the dead horse, but
Yep.
know the controls that you care about, that match up with your organization and your business, number one. Number two, every SOC report should have a set of user entity controls. Those are controls that are your responsibility to have controls for. You need to go through those and ensure that, yes, we have controls for each one of these, right? And document that is a yes. That is your delta, to Derek's point. Your delta is to make sure that you have those controls in place, because that's your responsibility.
And we talked a little bit about the SIGs and the SIG, and there's a SIG Lite too, which I like for obvious reasons, because I'm not light, so I like anything that is. But one of the, that can actually also work as a SOC, but not one that has been attested to by a third party. You can say, hey, here's our SIG, controls all our questions and all our answers for all our security things you may ever want. I don't want to answer your questionnaire. I'm going to give you our default questionnaire in place of it. It's a lot of work getting this up and running. So, the goal in that would be, hey, if I get 100 questionnaires a year, if I can create this one, and again, pass it off and say, these are all our things, this is our boilerplate, ask us what the delta is. So this is the ability to, to maybe save you some time and effort. Again, doesn't fit for everybody, but I've seen a couple of people use it and hand it off rather than answer any of my questions. And usually it will. And I put a link in there because it's a standard thing. And then I mentioned Rapid7 earlier with security packages, where some of the, usually these are larger organizations, but I can use AWS too. You can go in and find all their security stuff and download it in a nice little bow and things like that. So they're not going to answer your questions. You may have to search for them, but in a lot of cases, they'll give you a security package instead that goes into their details on what they do and how they do it. So this was, we've touched on this throughout, but I just kind of wanted to wrap this in a bow for you guys so that it was all on one slide. And that is that. So we've got a couple of minutes. I can, I've got a little time afterwards, so you can keep this going. Nick, what sort of questions do we have?
Perfect. I have 2 questions now. And just as a reminder, everybody, get those questions in now if you want them to be answered. If not, you can email us after the fact. How do you feel about screen scraping when the vendor will not provide documents and states that screen scraping is not allowed?
Well, I guess what are you going to do if you find something, right? You're going to tell them that you did something that they don't want you to do. I guess how does that go? So I think, again, for me, the best way is being upfront, right? And having a call, making them understand why we're doing this. And if it's a vendor of yours, then we got to look at maybe moving to another vendor, or the business accepts the risk because that vendor is too critical to what we do. So I think it just brings up a different kind of conversation. But if they don't want me doing something, even if I do it, I don't think I can act on it. It's almost like, I'm going to come up with a bad analogy, but reading your daughter's journal and then holding her accountable for something she wrote in it, right? Like, it's probably not the best analogy, but the first one that came to my mind. I don't read my daughter's journal. Definitely.
Anymore.
Never. We would never do that.
Derek, did you want to take a stab at that before I move to the next one?
No. He knocked it out of the park. I don't have anything to add.
Perfect. Are there recommended levels of cybersecurity insurance and standard legal terms that should appear in our vendor contracts?
Different. I mean, it's different for every vendor.
Yeah, the bottom line is, can is what do you need to cover? And I always go worst case scenario. If you get compromised, if you get ransomware, if you get breached, it's and this is where you kind of get your finance guys involved too. What's your potential for loss? And based on the cost of the insurance, how much are you willing to carry to be able to cover it? So CJ's right. It really is different based on what it is. There's not a set thing. There's, in some cases you want to cover enough so that you could, are you going to cover enough to make your customers whole? Are you going to cover enough to make sure your business continues to run based on what's liability, stuff like that? So those are business decisions usually made at, the executive level. But what you want to do, especially if you're security guys, you want to stand in their office and say, listen, we've got to have it. What we decide on can be done as a group, but we can't go without it.